Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Jennifer Kaschak from the University of Scranton. I'm the Communications Officer for the AERA Social Studies Research SIG. It's an honor to welcome you all to the Teaching for Black Lives in Social Studies Teacher Education webinar. As a reminder, this event is being recorded for future viewing through AERA Social Studies Research SIG's YouTube page. This is the first event in a series of webinars co-hosted by the AERA Social Studies Research SIG and the CUFA Scholars of Color Forum. Throughout this series, we will discuss issues related to racial justice, equity, and inclusion in social studies teacher education. We are honored to have a distinguished group of panelists here today. First, Dr. Kristen Duncan, Assistant Professor of Social Studies Education at Clemson University. Second, Dr. Denisha Jones, Esquire, Director of the Art of Teaching Program at Sarah Lawrence College. Additionally, Dr. Crystal Simmons, Assistant Professor of Social Studies, Multicultural and International Education at SUNY Geneseo. Finally, the discussion will be moderated by Dr. Tiffany Patterson, Assistant Professor of Social Studies Education at West Virginia University. Before we begin, here are a few expectations for participants. First, for those of you in the audience, we ask that you keep your microphones on mute and cameras off throughout the event. This will assist with managing bandwidth and keep focus on our panelists. If you would like to ask a panelist a question, please share it in the chat feature. Delandria Hall of the University of Texas at Austin will be curating questions to ask the group when the Q&A session begins. Additionally, we expect that comments shared in the chat feature are respectful, thoughtful, and appropriate. If any comments are shared by audience members that distract from the purpose of this event or are racist, sexist, homophobic, or in any way derogatory, we reserve the right to remove audience members from the session. Zoom bombing will not be tolerated. Without further delay, I'll hand it off to Dr. Mitchell Patterson to lead this discussion.
Thank you very much. I am so excited. Like you can just feel it in my bones because we're about to have just a great conversation. I'm excited to be in conversation with you all, with everyone that is here in the chat, and the conversations that will come forth after this discussion. And these are not only powerful professors, but I look to them as sister scholars in the field as well. So this is both a treat for me and a delight. So let's get started. I would like to begin by giving each of you a few minutes, and I know it's hard for each of you, but a few minutes to address the following. What does it even mean to teach for Black lives? And what should social studies teacher education, how should we play an effort in this movement? So what does it mean to teach for Black lives? And let's get started with Dr. Duncan.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I think that teaching for Black lives means we are centering Black lives in our teaching, right? So in the way history in particular is traditionally taught, pretty much anything Black is relegated to the margins. So it's either not covered or it's shallowly covered or it's relegated to February, right? I always give my pre-service teachers the example of my world history course in high school. So my high school world history teacher spent a month on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We spent literally one day on the continent of Africa. I am not exaggerating. February 3rd, the day of the African American read-in, is the only day we learned about history in that, African history in that class. So that's a pretty extreme example, but Black people exist beyond enslavement and the civil rights movement. So teaching for Black lives means centering Black stories, Black histories, Black experiences, and acknowledging the stories, histories, and experiences of the Black students in your classroom, or helping the non-Black students in your classroom learn those histories and experiences.
Absolutely. Dr. Jones?
Thank you all so much for having me. To build upon what Dr. Duncan said, in addition to centering them, we need to really affirm what it means to be Black and Blackness and Black identity. And a lot of what schooling does is to not affirm, is to make Black children and Black people and brown people feel inferior from the inception, right? We all, and we start this with just very young children in general, where we see them as full of deficits and focus on things they can't do, but it's even done to a further extreme with Black children, right? Where they're not only a deficit, their whole family and their whole culture and their whole people are a deficit, right? So we have to address that. So teaching for Black lives is really about affirming Blackness and Black identity, and also exploring what it means for Black liberation. In the words of Dr. Patina Love, Black mattering. What does it mean to matter as Black children in this world? And to really do that Black identity work that so much of social studies education does on a national level, but not for Black children, right? So much of the citizenship education we see in early childhood is for making kids feel good about being an American, but it's about being a white American. It's like, look what all the white people done, and we don't do that for Black people. And why don't we? And we actually really need to specifically and explicitly talk about making Black children feel good about being Black and having a Black history in this country.
Dr. Simmons.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, just to add on to what both Kristen and Denisha talked about, three things come to mind for me. The first one is also centering. So when we teach for Black lives, we are empowering, we're liberating all students. So for Black students, as both Kristen and Denisha mentioned, we are creating and demanding spaces where the culture and lived experiences of Black people across the diaspora are recognized, they're validated, and they're valued for their contributions to the world. And when we do this, we're not just doing it solely from the lens of victimization and oppression, but we're also thinking about acknowledging and emphasizing stories of resistance, resiliency, and joy. And as it was already mentioned, this aids in a positive and healthy racial identity for Black children, but for other students, and particularly white students, we are challenging myths and stereotypes that they may hold as a result of a lack of historical knowledge and socialization. Secondly, teaching for Black lives is essential for the upholding of democratic values. So as social studies educators, we know that, again, part of our charge is to prepare students to be engaged and effective citizens for a democratic society that embraces equality for all. But by not teaching for Black lives, we're posing a threat to that very aim and goal. And so we need to continue to interrogate and challenge the ways full citizenship rights are granted to some and not others. And then thirdly, this kind of goes outside of the field of education, but just in teaching in general, but I think it's essential, is we need to reimagine how schools are operated and are designed. So teaching for Black lives goes beyond, as I mentioned, just beyond the curriculum and our teaching practices, but we need to critique and challenge the ways we operate and work within an institution that upholds racist ideas and policies. And so we should begin to address our discipline or zero tolerance policies in our school. We should explore the ways we recommend students for special education services. I mean, we have an overwhelming number of Black and brown students with IEPs, but not enough recommended for academically gifted programs. Administrators should think about their hiring practices and, who are we hiring? How do we embed equity into our practices? Right now, we're living in unprecedented times with remote and virtual learning. So how can we ensure that every home has access to internet or a computer? So we must also address these structural inequities that continue to create opportunity gaps in the educational experiences of Black children as well.
I don't know about everyone else, but I have literally goosebumps just listening to you. And that was question one. I want to also encourage everyone, as questions come up for you, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be collecting questions as we go through. Now we want to dive kind of deeper into your individual research and kind of give us a little bit of context of this topic within the field in which you work. So let's start with Dr. Jones. Much of your work is focused on early and elementary education. In what ways might early childhood and elementary social studies teacher educators take up teaching for Black lives in their classes?
Yeah, so I was a kindergarten teacher, and I've been training mainly early childhood teachers and also elementary teachers for quite a while. So I've been really exploring this in some research that I'm actually working on right now. I'm being a part of the Black Lives Matter at School Coalition, using the 13 guiding principles. I've been really exploring, it's something that Crystal just mentioned, this idea of citizenship, right? And also citizenship education. And what does that mean in early childhood? And I came across the concept of cultural citizenship, which I've seen in other people's research, typically looking around Latinx students and their identities, Asian American students and their identities, which has been amazing work, and even amazing Asian American teachers, right, and how they view cultural citizenship. But I started to think about what does it mean for Black children, right, and citizenship for Black people, which is something that sometimes we grapple with and sometimes we don't, right? We feel like, oh, citizenship is not an issue if you're born in America, right? But we know that Black people have always had a contested relationship with citizenship education and citizenship status. And Gloria Ladson-Billings gives this as an example when she talks about critical race theory. She talks about how, you know, how do you take people who were treated as property and then turn them into citizens, right? And so, and then by that, then what kind of citizenship education are they getting? And what I'm proposing is that traditional schooling sets up citizenship education for young children to, again, be focused on these broad concepts that really don't do anything to focus on what it means to be a Black child in this country, right? So we can talk about community helpers, right, and how that's so important. Well, in a lot of places, police are considered community helpers. And we're gonna have a hard time trying to tell Black children that they should see police as community helpers, given where we are in this country right now and all the issues around police brutality. So we have to really conceptualize what is it that citizenship education should be doing for Black children. And that's why I'm so into the 13 guiding principles, because they set a foundation that's so positive and identity developing, right? I remember when I was teaching kindergarten, you know, it was Black History Month, and a lot of the teachers wanted to start teaching about slavery. And I'm like, but to 5-year-olds, like that is American history. That's not Black history, right? Black History Month is not the time to sit 5-year-olds down and talk to them about slavery, right? So I did something simple on inventors, right? We just studied Black inventors for the month, and that they collected a lot of materials, and I let them invent something that they created, right? Something crazy like that, just out of a bunch of recyclable material. So the focus was on something positive, right? So that's, I think, what we're trying to get here, is that starting in the young age with really young children, we need to build that positive identity. When we explore things like Black villages and Black families and intergenerational or diversity or globalism, or some of the themes like restorative justice and empathy and loving engagement, right? That's gonna set this positive foundation so that when they do get to American history, which is about slavery and civil rights and those sorts of things, they know that that's not who they are, right? That's what was done to them, but their people are more than that. And so cultural citizenship education is about affirming your rights to this country as a citizen, as a person, from who you are. And we really need to explicitly think about that for Black children. And so I think social studies is perfect for this. You know, I did a review of the book Teaching for Black Lives for the Oregon Social Studies Journal, and it's really clear that social studies education can really do this and do this well, because that's the place where it fits in. That's the place where this works. And a lot of teachers are saying, oh, we don't have time for this curriculum, where did it go? It goes into your social studies. And I know we don't make enough time for social studies, but we should and we can. And it goes into your citizenship education, and it goes into your community education. And so we can make space for that, but we have to be really intentional about the messages that we're sending to young children.
I love that point. And it seems like each one of you have been making that point, that this history is expansive. And we also need to be very mindful and intentional about when and where we start certain histories with our students. Let's take that then as a perfect segue to Dr. Simmons. Your appointment is situated across social studies, multicultural education, and international education. So in what ways might a global and international perspective help inform us as we consider teaching for Black lives in teacher education?
Yeah, thank you. So all three of those, social studies, multicultural, and international education, they all intersect and they inform each other. So keeping in line with this idea of social studies and democratic citizenship, it's important that when we talk about citizenship, that we look beyond just the role and status of being a citizen of our local communities or our nation, but the idea that we are also global citizens. So with that, it is important to understand that anti-Blackness is just not endemic to the United States, that it is global, particularly as it relates to legacies of colonialism. There have been documented cases just recently of police brutality in Brazil. We're also seeing incidences of xenophobia in China with the pandemic and racial discrimination towards African migrants, and in India as well. And just a few years ago, there was the hashtag traveling while Black that was trending on Twitter, documenting the experiences of Black people as they travel throughout the world. And unfortunately, what these incidents also show is that anti-Blackness also exists and is often perpetuated even within communities of color. And as a result of all of this racial unrest and then even the killing of George Floyd this past summer, the UN Human Rights Council just drafted a resolution led by a group of African nations that condemned structural racism. And again, these are just a few examples of how white supremacy operates and functions on global scales. So when I'm teaching my methods courses, I reiterate this point that we are global citizens and we should be preparing our students to work and interact within a globalized society. And that, again, white supremacy is a global phenomenon that must be addressed and destroyed. So when we're looking at our state standards and we're talking about Black histories, I'm always encouraging them to think about the ways that they can bring in a global perspective to what it is that they're teaching, and to ask questions such as like whose stories are being addressed in these standards, whose are missing, what's happening in the world, that will provide us additional insights into whatever we're studying. And ultimately, we shouldn't limit having our discussions to the world to a global history course.
Thank you. Let's then now, because you're demonstrating as, a Black educator as well, being attuned to being able to do this work. And so let's segue then to Dr. Duncan. Your work focusing on the experience of Black teachers suggests that social studies, teacher education, we could do a lot better. We can do a much better job of supporting Black pre-service teachers, and that there's a lot that we can learn from Black teachers in general. And so in what ways can social studies teacher educators centralize concerns for Black pre-service teachers?
So really all of teacher education can do a much better job at supporting Black pre-service teachers. I think that starts with teaching pre-service teachers how to value the knowledge that people bring with them, right? So people have their own lived experiences, and they know what they know because of what they've lived through, what their families have lived through. But for some people, if they didn't read that in a book, right? If your lived experience is different than what I read in this book, then it's not valuable. We need to eradicate that, right? Like people's knowledges and lived experiences are valuable. The biggest thing I think teacher education can do, and this is my goal, hopefully it'll be achieved and I can find another goal to work towards. But I would love to see teacher education programs center race, right? So race in and of itself is marginalized in teacher education programs. So either it occurs, it's discussed solely in the diversity course, right? Or if it's discussed in a different course, it's only discussed in 1 week. So we discussed race this 1 week, so apparently it's only involved in this one issue. No, there's no aspect of education in which race isn't a salient issue. So those kinds of things would essentially help white pre-service teachers learn a lot about race and help them understand the perspectives that Black pre-service teachers are bringing, because a lot of the research about Black teachers and Black pre-service teachers is about how they're isolated. My work is about how they're having to interrupt the racism of their white colleagues, so while trying to do other work with Black students. So if we could eliminate some of those other issues, then some of the issues, yet another thing that Black teachers are facing would be eliminated if we could address that with white pre-service teachers.
What I'm hearing is from all three of you is this work is for everyone, and anti-Blackness is global, and we all have a lot of work to do. Dr. Jones, you've been a leader in the Black Lives Matter at School movement. Got my shirt on, saw a little product placement, got my merch going. How do we in the social studies field and teacher education, how do we become a part of the Black Lives Matter at School movement?
Yes, I've been fortunate to be a part of this since we became a national group in 2017 for the 2017-2018 school year. And it's been amazing, and it's open for everyone, right? So first thing I would say is tap into your local area that's doing the planning. So the work happens in two levels, right? I'm on a part of a national steering committee where we look at the work nationally, but the work gets done each year in the cities, right? So now that I live in New York, I'm in the New York City teacher group. I used to be in the DC group, right? So there might be a local group in your city already doing this work. We had over 30 to 50 cities participate in the first year alone, and we don't track, like we don't know how many people are doing it in all the different cities, but that's the first place you wanna start. And so in the local cities, they start planning, like we're gonna have our meeting in New York in October, our first general meeting, and what we do is plan the week of action. And the week of action is the first week in February. You know, we try and keep that standard across the calendar so that it works for everyone. And all the work is done in that local city to kind of figure out what are they going to do for that week of action. They typically plan activities and events around the 13 guiding principles or around the demands, right? So we have 4 demands on hiring more Black teachers, ending the use of zero tolerance and using restorative justice, mandating ethnic studies and Black history curriculum, and fund counselors, not cops. So we might have teach-ins around the need for Black teachers or the need for restorative justice, or you might do a support event for Black teachers. Last year in New York City, they had a Black wellness event for teachers, for Black teachers, and that was also really great. So it really is the work of those folks kind of doing it. At the higher education level, we are forming a group for higher ed. We've been doing it. So in the past couple of years, we've done a couple petitions, which a lot of you signed. I know I put it in the CUFA listserv, and a lot of my social studies friends have signed that list. We just sent out another one where we're inviting people to join us for planning. What does this mean in higher education? Because it looks a little bit different, right, than in the K-12 space. Also this year we enacted what we called a year of purpose. So, you know, it started as a day in Seattle. Teachers at John Muir Elementary School wanted to do a day in 2016, a teach-in on Black lives and show their support. Then the educators in Philadelphia and part of the Working Educators Caucus, they took it to a week of action using the 13 guiding principles of the Global Black Lives Matter Network and creating curriculum. And now this year we've come into this idea that it's a year of purpose. We want you to be thinking about this work throughout the year. So we have the year of purpose on our website. We have these great reflection questions that a couple of our steering committee members and other allies wrote and authored in a publication with Education for Liberation Network. We've also identified different dates throughout the year to focus on the different principles. So in October 14th is George Floyd's birthday. So we're calling it Justice for George Day. And our principal highlight is restorative justice. So right, you can spend some time talking about children. What does it mean to use restorative justice, and thinking about George Floyd and all the other George Floyds that we know and don't know of that have also died at the hands of police brutality, right? And in November, we're looking at Transgender Day of Remembrance and looking at our trans affirming principle and uplifting unknown folks like William Dorsey Swan, who was like the first Black trans person, and he was he was enslaved, right? And this man still was out there in the late 1800s, you know, living his best Black trans life, not really letting anybody stop. I mean, that is just to me so moving. Could you imagine if young Black children knew this? Like, this is not a new phenomenon, right? We've had people from the 1800s doing this and living this life. So we invite you to check out the list of activities for each month and to get involved. You can always send an email to blacklivesmatter@school2@gmail.com. If you're interested in your question and you didn't get the invitation for the for the higher ed committee if you're interested in doing that. But just supporting the local teachers who do this work is also really important, because the curriculum, we have a national curriculum committee, they're already meeting. So we curate a curriculum by looking for resources, and we like to get that out by Martin Luther King Day, so that there's a lot of materials. I'm not sure if they're planning something different around the year of purpose, but that's a way to get involved, is to join the curriculum committee at the national level. Local cities also do curriculums because they want the curriculum to be representative of their community. And what I used to do in the higher ed space when I was in DC was to host the curriculum fair for the local community, right? So at the college, so now Howard University, the School of Education, they host a curriculum fair for the DC area educators for social justice who organize the Week of Action, because a lot of teachers don't know this material, right? So we want them to come in on a Saturday and like go through the materials and learn about it and ask questions with teachers who've taught it. And it'd be great to have social studies teacher educators really helping to inform the curriculum and making sure that it's like, really good social studies teaching, right? And what does that look like? And so there's just so much that people can do, and we welcome folks to join us all over. We're definitely looking for more people in the South. We don't have as much representation out there. We've got a lot of the coast covered, but the Midwest, the South, all over, we'd love to have you guys join us and to really take this work to the next level.
And I can vouch for someone who, when I was teaching, went to that curriculum fair at Trinity when Dr. Jones was there. It's an amazing partnership between universities and schools, and also the work that you can do with your pre-service teachers. So be sure to check some of the links that are there. We're going to also make sure that we get that link to you for the Higher Education Steering Committee if you're interested in joining that, participating in the Year of Purpose. Let's talk a little bit about some of this pre-work. We know that people are coming to this work in different places. Us as teacher educators, we know some people have been invested and been doing this work and looking for ways to dive deeper. We know that in some places, this is just starting the conversation. And so we welcome all of that, and we welcome all of you where you are. We want to meet you where you are. So I want to ask each one of you, what pre-work or resources or strategies do you suggest teacher educators utilize when teaching for Black lives? And let's start with Dr. Simmons.
Sure. For me, the first thing that I always do is I really believe in this idea of critical self-reflection of identity and privilege. I think that's extremely important. So before you can begin to understand someone else's culture, you must first understand your own. And so I have students read Beverly Tatum's Complexity of Identity, Who Am I? And in that article, she actually describes an activity that she does with her students, and I actually do the same. And it's, she gives students about a 2-minute time frame, and she asks them to list as many aspects of their identity as they can. And what she has found is that what many students end up listing is personality traits. So, idea that they're kind, they're caring, they're honest. However, BIPOC students would usually identify their race or their ethnic group, and white students who grew up typically in strong ethnic enclaves would mention being, either Italian or Irish. Yet, white students rarely acknowledge being white. And she found similar patterns in terms of, gender, religion, sexuality. Women typically, however, would mention that they're being female. But I have found similar findings, as I mentioned, with my students. And for me, what this reveals and what Tatum talks about is that the parts of our identity that are the salient to us, or most salient to us and to others, are what capture our attention. And those that are not are often what we don't have to think about, or it's part of the norm or dominant way of thinking. And I think this type of activity, particularly for my students, helps them to unpack privilege and discussions around power. And more importantly, when we explore aspects of our identity, we have a better sense of how we see the world, what we value, and our beliefs, and how that translates into the curriculum that we teach, how we interact with our students and their parents. So for me, it's always engaging in critical self-reflection.
Dr. Duncan?
I would say start with the understanding that Black lives have to matter even when they in the room, right? So there's always or often this understanding that people need certain kinds of perspectives if they're teaching students of color or Black kids specifically. But no, white teachers who are going to teach white kids also need to understand that Black Lives Matter. So I would say to start there. But I would also recommend Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children. Um, in that book, she does an excellent job of pointing out things that often get swept under the rug. So I remember one of the things I remember vividly is there was a conversation she had with her Black doc students who were full-time teachers, and they were talking about how their colleagues treated them in class. So they were having certain experiences, and their peers were like, well, the book says this. And they're like, but I'm telling you, in real life, this is happening. So Lisa Delpit, I think she does an excellent job of calling out some things that just quite frankly need to be called out, because we can't move forward until we acknowledge some things.
Dr. Jones?
I was typing in the chat. You're asking for resources that we use, correct? Oh,
yes, resources. Put them in there.
Yeah, no, someone was messaging me privately, but yes, I second all. I definitely use Beverly Tatum. That article, thank you for that, Crystal. I use her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? But now I can start with that article when we start talking about children and identity, and that's also really helpful. And yes, Kristen, to other people's children, that's so important. I mentioned earlier Bettina Love's excellent book, Why We Want to Do More Than Survive. That's also, I think, something that's been really helpful with students and using that text as well. God, there's so many resources out there. I mentioned again the other book, Teaching for Black Lives. And so this one is really helpful. The only thing, I wrote a book review on it. My only criticism is there's not enough early childhood. It's such a great book, and a lot of the lessons that they do are perfect for middle school and high school. And so on the website for Rethinking Schools, they also give you some of the materials. So like I use that book in an online diversity course I teach at Howard University, but when I was teaching in person, I could also pull some of the materials. So they do this mixer activity on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to get students to think about the process they had to do on making decisions and who to align with. So like there was a lot of work to do. So they give you all of the templates that you need for that. Or they do a Tuskegee syphilis experiment mixer, where you get to meet people who were affected by the study in different ways. And so there's a lot of great resources out there. And I have my students read that book. We actually start with Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And then we end with Teaching for Black Lives, because it really shows the diversity. And I think Crystal spoke to this earlier, the globalism, right? And within this movement. And so there's a great chapter on Afro-Mexican identity, right? And you have Mexican students saying, what? There are Africans in Mexico? Like that, they don't believe their teacher, right? They don't know this. And they're like, why don't we know this, right? Why don't we know that there are Africans in Mexico, right? So that's a great diversity chapter. There's also a chapter on queering Black history. So when we think about people like William Dorsey Son, who I mentioned earlier, like how do we bring that in? So it's just a really great resource. And it's not out yet, but pretty soon, oh, you can't see it because I have my screen up. We have an edited book coming out, me and Jesse Hagopian, called Black Lives Matter at School, an uprising for educational justice, which will be out this December, which also highlights a lot of the work that the people have been doing within this movement as well too. I don't know which one you need a link for.
No, that's perfect. That's a perfect segue with resources. And I was thinking that maybe let's jump to some of the questions that people have in the chat, and let's talk about some of those things. So how have you included undergraduate and graduate students in this important work that you are doing? So we got that question. Shout out, Ann.
Do you want any of us?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to start with somebody. Let's start with Dr. Duncan, since you got off mute real quick.
All right, so I have only taught pre-service teachers. So I have primarily works with undergraduates. Right now, I'm teaching, I suppose it's off the books, but I got some recent alums, some students that I've taught together to study anti-racist teaching, because that's something that they want to work on. And centering Black lives has to be part of that, right? So in my undergrad classes, we talk about race every week because race is involved in everything. So when we talk about teaching history and historical narratives, race is included in that. When we talk about teaching civics and notions of citizenship, race is included in that. Same with all the disciplines in social studies. I have a section on incorporating LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum. Race is included in that as well. So making sure that they understand that Black life intersects with all of these aspects of social studies is primarily how I have gone about this work thus far.
So again, remember, this is a thread that goes throughout. And so your students experience this beyond. I'll open it up to either one of you that would like to answer that question.
So I'll jump in. Right now, the first module, we're actually wrapping it up this week, but the first module that my students participated in was Antiracist Education. So one of the very first readings that they had to kind of, read and unpack is the idea of race as a social construction. And then again, bringing in Beverly Tatum's piece where she talks about defining racism. So what is racism? I think it's important that students understand what is race and how racism operates in order for us to really understand systemic and institutionalized racism in this country. We have to understand what those terms means and operationalize those. So I have my students read those articles. And then again, we do some identity work where they engage in some critical self-reflection of their own identity and privilege. I even have them look at, New York State has this data report card of all the schools and their achievement scores. And I have students to analyze those and see the differences in various school districts and have them really think about educational inequities, as I talked about earlier, and what's contributing to that. Redlining. Schools are highly segregated. They're poorly resourced and underfunded. So they're kind of making those connections. So that's what I really do with my undergraduates. That's the first module that we participated in. And then with a graduate student this past summer, I did a directed study and we read Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. And so he was doing a master's program in social studies education. And so we were reading the book, we would have discussions on it weekly. And then I had him do like an inquiry lesson. So what can he take from Kendi's work and then implement into an inquiry lesson for a future social studies classroom, high school classroom. So that's just some of the ways that I've had my undergraduate and graduate students engage in this work.
We have a lot of really, really juicy questions. So Dr. Jones, if you wanted to add a thought to that question, or we can move on to some other questions.
I think that was good. I just say, find a way to tie it into all of your work. I'm teaching a special education class. I think Crystal or someone mentioned about special. We started the first day looking at disability justice and what does that mean and the intersection of race and gender and class and disability and discipline. So it's just as simple as just bringing them the data and having these conversations and letting them unpack it. No matter what course you're teaching, it all connects in some way.
And that kind of ties into one of the other questions that emerged about integrating this in beyond social studies. So we know that this particular forum is directed to social studies. And I think that Dr. Duncan, all of you have spoken to that this is work for teacher education, period. Any ideas of how to integrate BLM? And I would refer you all to Black Lives Matter in Schools and those local websites that have tons and tons of lessons from teachers that are doing this work in schools across disciplines. But maybe Dr. Jones, if you wanted to share any quick insight on that.
Sure. I mean, it definitely can be in all the disciplines. When I was teaching science methods course one year, which was really weird because that's not me, elementary method science. You know, we addressed it in ways too. So some ways I had some actually research, BIPOC scientists, you know, and then my students were hard pressed to find Native, you know, indigenous scientists. And they were like, it's really hard to find someone. Why is this information? We know they exist, right? But the information is hard to find. So like asking them to like start by looking that up and that information, you can do it in a course, and of course teaching science methods, and then really looking at inequities within your field, right? So science is about research and data, and you can do that and look at, you know, inequities that people face in their communities. In Teaching for Black Lives, they talk about plotting inequities as kind of a math and science activity in a community, looking at lead in the water, right? So there's a lot of things that you just have to want the focus to be on these things, right? Like the concepts that you want to teach can be taught, it's how you're going to frame them, right? We all know that within literacy, right? We want students to develop certain literacy skills, but we know what they read matters, right? Well, it's the same thing. If you want students to practice solving equations, how you set up that equation matters, and what context you're giving them matters to then do that work. So it's not just in social studies education, right? It can be in a lot of different fields. And I think for my colleagues that I'm working with right now, like they have to question, like, are they doing that work themselves? Are you decolonizing your syllabus and your materials to bring in these diverse perspectives? Because it really does begin there, right? If your whole reading list is just white people and dead white people and old white, like you're not doing anything to help students think critically, right? So we are trying to break that up in the psychology department at my college, and where I'm a part of, where we are bringing in all of these different perspectives. I start my class talking about global South versus global North, onto epistemologies. Like, what does that mean? And like one of them, it starts off by saying the brilliance of Black children, and someone is saying, what is she referring to? I'm like, she's referring to something that you can't conceive in your mind, that Black children are brilliant. That is what she's telling you, and you're acting like, where does this come from? It comes from her knowledge of being a Black woman, that Black children are brilliant. She doesn't need to defend that to you or prove that to you, but a lot of what we are led to believe is that that statement needs proof. It doesn't need any proof, right? And so we have to really break down those barriers in our classroom by having them read these scholars that they won't ever come across if we don't really present it to them.
So you can do this work across setting that context is important, teaching students about systemic analysis, and then it can carry, and what you choose to center in your classroom is a signal to students. And I want to ask this question because this came from the chat. Joe asked this question because I want to also make sure that we're also centering Black students. And so what advice do you have for respecting, honoring, protecting Black students without requiring their emotional labor or having to experience the difficulty of white students learning and unlearning, for example, when working with white students to unpack this? And so let's toss that to Dr. Duncan, given your work with Black pre-service teachers and having to do that, and how that can maybe translate to the classroom.
I see you, Joe, coming with the hard questions on this Friday afternoon. So this really is a challenge, right? Because white pre-service teachers have a lot to learn, and this can be a challenging process. And we also don't want to re-traumatize Black pre-service teachers. One, I would hope that no one who is cognizant enough to be on this webinar is doing things like this, but teachers of, Black teachers of all ages have talked about being in classes and an issue of race came up and every head in the room turned to them, and that's who the instructor calls on. So we start by not expecting our Black pre-service teachers to speak for all 30 however million Black folks are in the US and even more abroad, right? But also, when we talk about these difficult issues, we have to do just like we teach our pre-service teachers, right? We need to create class norms so that students know what is acceptable and what is unacceptable to be said in our spaces. Also, we need to be thinking about our Black pre-service teachers when we are thinking of how to discuss race with our students, right? So if we know that if we pose certain questions that it'll get a certain response from white pre-service teachers, maybe we pose a different question. And also, my final recommendation is that we don't expect the Black pre-service teachers to teach white pre-service teachers everything they need to know. They're also there to learn how to be teachers, so we shouldn't be putting the onus on them to teach everybody about their experiences. We don't want to give them extra labor, right? It really is a challenge. It's a line that we walk delicately, but ultimately, and hopefully you have relationships with your pre-service teachers as individuals so that you can read people's cues. Parts of this really are similar to being a K-12 teacher, right? Like, we can read our students' cues and know when they're uncomfortable. And if it's a discomfort we can wrestle through, or if it's a discomfort we need to back away from. I can't lie, it really is a challenge, and it takes time and experience. So I apologize for not being able to give you a how-to manual, but it's a fine line that we practice walking every day.
This is messy, complicated, nuanced work that's going to have bumps in the road, and you're not going to always get it right. And so it's going to be really important that you own that, you're transparent about your own journey with students so that they can have a model for being transparent themselves as well. So you mentioned challenge, and there's a couple of questions around resistance. So how do you deal with resistance, maybe not only from teachers, but as they go into pre-service teachers, go into placements, maybe wanting to do this work and are getting pushback? How are you navigating that with your school partners and preparing them, or even in your own classroom, students that might be resistant to this knowledge? So let's start with Dr. Simmons.
Yeah, I think first we just have to understand that resistance is part of the territory, unfortunately, with this work, and it won't be easy, doing it, but by standing by and not taking any action, we're honestly being complicit with anti-Blackness. But as I kept mentioning before, these topics are necessary for the health of our democracy, and we can't shy away from these conversations. For teachers out in the schools and our pre-service teachers and those already in service, I encourage them to utilize their professional organizations, their duties and their standards to support them in the teaching for Black lives. NCSS has several position statements that are made available that, they can always make reference to as, a rationale for why this work is important. Nowadays too, teachers are also being observed. They're being evaluated. I know here in the state of New York, there's criteria in which teachers have to demonstrate the ways in which they're being attentive to issues around inclusivity and diversity and issues around race. This work needs to be done, and, it comes with the territory's resistance will, but, for the sake of our democracy, we have to push forward.
So each of you in a way talked about how we need to move beyond certain topics. Well, not just move beyond, but we need to teach the expansive history. We can't just teach civil rights and slavery. And when we even teach those, we need to teach them in very nuanced ways, because often there are narratives and grand narratives that go with that are taught that are problematic as well. How can we help not only pre-service teachers, but in-service teachers and our school partners, mentor teachers, really prioritize histories, Black histories that are more expansive? Any thoughts? Who would like to start that one? Well, you see everybody smiling, we'll see Dr. Jones. We have to get her back up in here.
Oh, sorry. That was such a lot. That you just said. I'm still trying to process all of that. Wow, that's just. And again, so help me. You said, how do we bring in the different?
Yeah, how do we teach beyond a few African American topics? So, yeah, what are some suggestions?
That's what I really noted in my book review for teaching Black history, or teaching for Black lives, right? That we always get, if you look at Black history, it's the same thing. It's slavery, civil rights, and what I call the magical Negroes of today, which is like Michael Jordan, Oprah, and Obama, right? Like, and that's it. And so it's a very, very limiting framework for Black. And for me, it was, I was like, really, that's it? So I gotta like either like be down with the slavery lessons or the civil rights struggle, or be real special. And there was like nothing in between. And I feel like we have to go to those in-between spaces of like what was happening in between. You know, there were so many people other than Martin and Malcolm and Rosa, right? Who are those people and how do we lift them up? So we looking at women like Claudette Colvin, right? And how do we bring her work into this story and her life, and how she did everything that Rosa Parks did, but why wasn't she given the same prominence in the movement as well too? Bayard Rustin, you know, a Black man, a gay man who is pretty much leading this work with Martin Luther King, but most people don't know this man's name, right? And then we also got to look at not just the people, but the moments and the movements and what were happening in history. This summer I participated, there's an organization known as Girl Track, and they're about getting Black women moving, and they just did this Black History Boot Camp, 21 acts of resistance. I mean, it's just amazing, like things you don't really think about. And it was international too. They were looking at Wangari Maathai and her work, right? And other people. And so I think you got to look at these moments of history too, and like what was happening, right? So one of the year of purpose, we're looking at Black artists, right? And so really thinking about Black Harlem and the art movement there and what was happening, and getting beyond just the few names that people know, and to really dive deep. And I think students really appreciate that opportunity to uncover this history that they don't really hear about and they don't really know about. Because I don't know about you, but when I talk to middle schoolers and they're like, here we go again, Martin, Rosa, and Malcolm, we're sick of this nonsense. Don't you know anybody else? And I feel them on that because they've been given that since they were 5 and they want a little bit more, right? And so I think you just have to search for it and uncover it. There's so much. I just came across a post about Native Black Indigenous people, right? That's a whole unit curriculum waiting to happen. I have a colleague I'm working with who's Afro-Ecuadorian, right? And there's so much they've been doing to uplift Afro-Latinx people in all of these communities, right? Students would love to know about that knowledge, right? Teaching about Islam through Black Muslims, right? That's a whole nother area that most people don't think about, right? Who are Black Muslim people? They're all over this country, right? How do they negotiate their identity as a Black person and as a Muslim or from practicing Islam, right? There's just so much that we can do. So I think it's like looking for the names we haven't heard of and the moments we don't really know about and amplifying them and letting the young people do the research to really learn about this stuff.
You have to do this work. You got to do it. You got to find these stories. Every one of those examples that was mentioned by Dr. Jones can be taught through the standards. Every one of them. We just have to have the vision and the creativity to be able to say we could teach the standard through this particular lens and students will still come out with those skills. So thank you for sharing it. I love how you said it, go in between. And even in those movements, let's teach them in complex ways. Let's teach the rebellious life of Rosa Parks. Let's teach outside of those traditional narratives. This is a start of a conversation. There are so many great questions we want to get to. This is literally 1 hour. So we just want you to know that we wanted to start this webinar with the sense of saying, hey, we got some powerful scholars in social studies. You have heard them. You need to cite them. You need to read them. You need to have them to come to your school. Pay them. Also, get your universities to pay them. We're not exploiting Black labor as we talked about, but these are powerful women that really you want to be sure that you are including them in your work. And so thank you again for joining us. We're just putting a pin in this conversation because we're going to keep these conversations going. All the questions that you're posing to us, continue to pose in your spaces, continue to grapple within your spaces and with us as well, connect with us through social media and all of that. So I'm going to actually now, and yes, this will be recorded, this will be available to all of you. I am going to turn it over to Dee. She's a fabulous, also emerging scholar in the field. Read and cite her work as well. And she's going to take us on home. Thank you again so much for joining us.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for just like thank you to Dr. Duncan, Dr. Jones, Dr. Simmons for participating in the panel. Thank you to Dr. Patterson for asking great questions and getting like everybody hyped. So we're not, this is Friday afternoon, y'all. So if you to our audience, we want to thank you for thoughtful questions. We hope the discussion leaves you with much to consider and reflect upon as you leave and go out into your spaces. I tried to add a link because I tried to copy and paste as much of many of the resources as we could, but it's also recorded, and so you can watch it later, and the transcript will be available. So if you will go to the Social Studies SIG YouTube page, you'll be able to see this discussion. But before we go, Jennifer is going to share a slide. And on that slide, I'd like to share what our next webinar is going to be. It's going to be on October 23rd at 4 Eastern Time. And we will be hosting a panel titled Critical Perspectives on Teaching the 2020 Presidential Election. Registration for the event will begin the first week of October. Is there a link to the SIG Social Studies SIG YouTube page?
We will be putting that out in a bit. So we got that coming. It's very brand new. So it will be coming soon. But definitely, as we wrap up, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to unmute your mic, say peace, say thank you, show gratitude. And please join us for our next one next month.
Tiffany, can I make a quick plug?
Oh yes, plug season.
So I will ask either Tiffany or Dee to add this link to the resources. But Tiffany, Crystal, and I actually worked, because people were asking for resources for teachers. Tiffany, Crystal, and I actually worked on some curriculum last year about teaching the civil rights movement. And I know we just said that Blackness exists beyond that, but these are completely different takes on teaching that movement. So like the unit I wrote was solely about the women in the Google Doc to those, so you can check them out.
Also, I was gonna say, if you follow everyone on Twitter, I think that you'll be able to keep up with a lot of the resources, and you'll be able, I know Tiffany, she'll post that link as soon as it comes with when the video
and will.
So if you could just follow everyone on Twitter or any of the social media, I think you'll be able to get a lot more resources.
So thank you again for coming. Feel free to unmute your mic. Peace out. Thank y'all for leaving. Check out Black Lives Matter at School, your purpose, all that.